When I first moved into flat 22 of the old building on Parker Street, I didn't think much of the stories that floated around about flat 23. It was just an empty unit next to mine, and from what I'd been told, it had been vacant for, or maybe someone fumbling with their keys down the hallway. But the noise continued. It sounded like footsteps pacing back and forth just outside my door, followed by the slightest scratching, like nails raking over wood. I lay there in bed, holding my breath, listening. The next morning I asked Mrs. Patel, the elderly woman who lived down the hall, about the noise. She gave me a strange look. "Oh, you'll get used to it," she said, adjusting her oversized glasses. "That flat has a mind of its own." "Flat 23, I asked, puzzled. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Hasn't been occupied for years. Last tenant ran out in the middle of the night, said he saw things." I laughed, though it sounded forced, and brushed it off as a neighborhood legend. But that night, the noises returned. This time, I was determined to get to the bottom of it. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to my front door, which I unlocked as quietly as possible. The hallway was pitch black. The bulbs in the hallway sconces had burned out, casting everything in a heavy, oppressive darkness. I clicked on my flashlight, and its narrow beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the faded wallpaper and old, creaky floorboards. Flat 23 was directly next to mine. The number 23 was scratched and faded, barely hanging onto the door. The brass handle was rusted, and the door frame looked like it hadn't been painted in decades. Just as I was about to step closer, I heard a faint whisper coming from behind the door. My heart pounded. I knew there shouldn't be anyone inside. "Hello," I called, instantly regretting it. My voice echoed down the empty hallway, and for a moment, there was silence. But then, a low moan crept out from behind the door of flat 23, making the hair on my arm stand on end. It was a sound that seemed to well up from deep within the walls, ancient and pained. I backed away and hurried back to my own flat, locking the door behind me. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay awake, listening to the relentless whispers, imagining things moving within flat 23. The next day, curiosity got the best of me. I did some digging, asking the building manager about the flat's history. He was reluctant at first, his eyes darting nervously whenever I mentioned the unit. "That flat's been trouble for years," he finally said, sighing. "Last few tenants claimed it was haunted. Doors slamming shut, lights flickering, shadows moving in the corners, and one man he stopped, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might overhear." I leaned in, waiting for him to continue. "One man disappeared," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Left everything behind. No note, no nothing. Police never found a trace." The hairs on my neck prickled, and I returned to my flat, feeling a strange pull to the place next door. That evening, around midnight, I decided to take another look. It felt reckless, but some force beyond my understanding drove me forward. I stood in front of flat 23's door, flashlight in hand, and before I could stop myself, I reached for the handle and twisted. To my surprise, it opened with a soft creak. The air inside was frigid, colder than it should have been, and a smell hit me, something foul, like old, rotting wood mixed with something metallic. I stepped inside, sweeping the beam of my flashlight around. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center, facing the wall. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But then I noticed something strange, a pattern on the walls. I squinted, shining my flashlight closer, and realized they weren't patterns, they were words. Scratched over and over, layer upon layer, all across the walls. "Let me out. Let me out. Let me out." I stumbled back, horrified, and in my panic, dropped the flashlight. The beam rolled across the floor, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. And then, as if in response to my intrusion, I heard it, the moan from the night before, louder and clearer, coming from right behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. My heart was pounding, my skin clammy with fear. And then, the chair in the center of the room creaked, as if something unseen had just sat down. I turned to flee, only to see the door had slammed shut. My hands scrambled against the knob, yanking and pulling, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, the moan grew louder, transforming into a series of tortured whispers. "Help me," one voice pleaded. "Let me out," another begged. They layered over each other, a chorus of voices, each desperate and filled with pain. My pulse pounded, and I banged on the door, screaming for help. Suddenly, the door burst open, and I tumbled out, collapsing onto the floor of the hallway. The building manager was there, his face pale as he helped me to my feet. "Never go back in there," he warned, his voice trembling. "You got lucky this time." I nodded, too shaken to argue, and stumbled back to my own flat, locking the door behind me. That night, I lay awake, the whispers from flat 23 echoing in my mind as if they had embedded themselves within me. I moved out the next morning. I didn't wait to pack properly. I left half my things behind. Even now, years later, I sometimes think I can hear those whispers, faint and distant, in the dead of night. And every time I wonder who or what is really trapped inside flat 23. Leaving that building didn't bring me the peace I'd hoped for. In fact, since that night it feels like I'm being followed. Sometimes, as I'm lying in bed, half asleep, I hear those faint, tortured voices let me out. "Help me. Save us." At first I tried to dismiss it as my mind playing tricks, a product of residual fear. But one evening as I was about to drift off, I felt something even stranger. I was lying in the dark, the air around me thick and suffocating, when I heard a faint tapping sound from the closet. My heart sank. It was exactly the same cadence as the one I'd heard from flat 23, the slow, deliberate tapping, as if something was trying to scratch its way out. I lay there, paralyzed, my breath catching in my throat, as the tapping grew louder. No, I thought. This can't be happening. I leapt from my bed and turned on every light in my room. The sound stopped. I forced myself to open the closet, flashlight in hand, and found nothing but my clothes. And yet, even with nothing visibly wrong, an unshakable feeling lingered, a feeling that something was watching me. The days following were worse. Flickering lights, random cold spots, strange noises in my apartment. It was as though the curse of flat 23 had followed me home. I could hardly sleep, fearing that if I closed my eyes, I might wake up to find myself somehow back inside that dreadful room. It all came to a head about a week later. I had been struggling to stay awake, existing on caffeine and adrenaline, when I decided to take a short walk to clear my head. I bundled up and left my apartment, the cool night air biting at my face. As I walked down the empty street, I felt a prickling sensation, as if someone was walking right behind me. I picked up my pace, but the footsteps behind me matched each stride, echoing eerily in the silence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I forced myself to glance over my shoulder. No one was there. I practically ran the rest of the way back, heart hammering, but as soon as I reached my building's front door, I heard it, the familiar, bone-chilling whisper, "Let me out." I rushed into my apartment, bolting the door, breathing heavily. My phone suddenly buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. It was a message from an unknown number, a string of letters and symbols that looked like garbled nonsense. But as I stared, something shifted. Letters rearranged themselves in my mind to form a coherent phrase, "I'm waiting in 23. A cold sweat broke over me. I didn't want to, but something inside me knew I had to return. I grabbed my keys, hesitating for a long moment at the door before I finally left. The building on Parker Street was quiet as ever when I arrived, yet somehow felt more alive in its silence, like it was waiting for me. The building manager was nowhere in sight. I took the stairs up, each step echoing louder in the deserted stairwell, the walls feeling as though they were closing in on me. My flashlight barely cut through the dense darkness when I reached the third floor. There it was, flat 23, the door slightly ajar. Taking a shaky breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was as thick and foul as the last time, and that rotten, metallic smell filled my nostrils again. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into utter darkness. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut. My heart thundered as I fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Cold fingers of dread crept up my spine, and I could feel it, something was behind me. I didn't want to turn around, but an unseen force compelled me. I spun on my heels, and my eyes fell upon a figure, shrouded in shadows, standing in the center of the room. It was a man, but he looked barely human. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were empty, soulless pits. His mouth opened, and that familiar, tormented whisper echoed from him, filling the room with the sound of countless voices layered over one another. "Help! Let me out! Save us!" I backed against the wall, trapped, as the figure moved closer. A sudden wave of icy pain surged through me, paralyzing me in place. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. The figure leaned closer, his empty eyes boring into mine, and I could feel him siphoning something from me, draining me of warmth, of life itself. Just as I felt my consciousness slipping, I heard a new sound, a loud banging on the door. The building manager's voice rang out, muffled but desperate. "Open up. Get out of there." With a sudden jolt, I found myself able to move. I stumbled to the door, twisting the handle as it finally gave way. The manager yanked me into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. "Didn't I warn you?" he said, voice thick with anger and fear. "Didn't I tell you never to go back in there?" I could barely reply, my body trembling, as he half carried me down the hall and out of the building. The police were called, but by the time they searched flat 23, it was empty, as though nothing had ever happened. They found no traces of the figure, no scratches on the walls, nothing. But that night haunted me, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw those empty, hollow eyes staring back at me, pleading for help. To this day, I still don't know what or who I encountered in that room. I've tried to forget, to put that cursed building behind me, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear it, a faint whisper, floating through the silence.